I appreciate the opportunity to be here. If nothing else, it reminds me of all the people that I don't see enough of. And I especially, my friend Mike Blum walked through the door, and Mike teaches at the university in Kansas. And so he informed me that he had recently moved to town. I'm like, yeah. So it's nice to have other people moving into town and joining the community, because it is such an amazing community of geoscientists. When I moved here from the University of Texas, one of the arguments that I made to my wife was, there's such an amazing community of geoscientists in the Rocky Mountains section. It's just, it's incomparable, right? There's nothing that compares to it. And so that's what I love, part of what I love about being around here. The other argument that I had made to her was it would be good for the pig to get into the Rocky Mountains, but unfortunately the pig, began to have problems with the snow, like the meter-high snows that we get in my house. And so we rehomed him in a fit of ignorance. We rehomed him at the 1st of April to a friend of mine's farm near Hempstead, where it's now 107. And he's laying in a mud hole in 107. So we've decided that was an absurd decision. And so we're in the process of buying a new house and moving the pig back. So don't worry, he's coming back. Yeah. But another reason that I, was interested in moving here was I had always worked so much out in the Western interior in this basin. And I worked over in the Sago basins and the Powder River basins. I'd worked down in the San Juan basin. We were working a lot. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about over the years. I've also worked in Trinidad. I've worked in shelf systems all over the world. And one thing I want to talk about a little bit is some of the realizations that I've had over the past, say, 20 to 30 years or so. Yes, I started geology when I was 10. It was about shelf systems. And I became really fascinated with the processes on shelf systems and how we don't really consider changes in environment and changes in climate and things. I used to think about the Cretaceous, and I was using modern analogs to talk about these Cretaceous shelf systems and how they're moving sand. And then I realized the modern present shelf systems in the oceans and climate, it's totally different than, say, the Coniacean or something of the super greenhouse environments of the Cretaceous. I mean, that really informs how processes are active along coastal areas in these shelf systems. So what I want to talk to you a little bit about today is how shelf processes are changing and how they inform the basinward movement of sands across the shelf and into deep water systems. So let's just kick that off. I think if I can get it going. Let me figure out how to go. I'm used to having my touch screen. Oh, look, it's a touch screen. This was what I kind of grew up with. This is my concept of classic sort of marine shelf systems, right? And you have like the shore zone, and then you have this, basically 50 meters out to 150 meters before you fall up into bathyal and lower bathyal water depths. And the thing is, the paleo guys get it, they're looking at carbonate compensation depths, and they even say in this little figure, they say this varies with latitude and time. And so one of the things though that sedimentologists haven't grasped, or a lot of us haven't grasped very well, is how the processes that are active in marine systems vary with latitude and with time, vary with climate, vary with storm intensity, vary with all these things that we now know changes quite a bit. The exception to this was a guy named Marty Perlmutter. And I don't even know where Marty Perlmutter is right now. He was engaged and working in one of the national laboratories, but he wrote quite a long paper back in the 80s and 90s talking about how sedimentology of systems varies depending on the latitude and the climate and things that were going on around the world. So I was always impressed with Marty's work. We see here that we've got an average. This is the type of thing that we teach in, sophomore stratigraphy sedimentology. The average modern shelf break is minus 130 meters. The average modern ocean depth is 3,750 meters. And so you get this impression up in here, wave dominated, tide dominated, that there's a fish swimming around in these photic zones, and just sort of having a magical life. The reality is a little bit more intense than that sometimes. You can figure out how to rapidly change this. See, I hate anything I have to be precise at. So the consequences of underestimating the activity on the shelf are pretty serious, especially today when we're interested in building structures on the shelf. We're interested in building, energy systems on the shelf, wind farms, laying cables, communication cables. We're putting rigs on the shelf where we can sequester all this carbon down into exhausted reservoirs on the shelf, right? But the reality is there's a lot going on the shelf, and it's only going to get more intense. You can destabilize or destroy seafloor installations. You can get major friction on shallow marine cabling. You can compromise rigs and placements, seafloor failure, generation of tsunamis. The second one was really brought to attention this past year when, one of the major companies, Ørsted AS, found that some of its cables connecting its wind farms had been damaged, and they were going to have to spend almost $500 million just to fix these cables in the offshore. And they were like, to their stockholders, they're like, we just didn't anticipate this cost, And so it's like those costs are happening all over the world. The other thing that we need to be aware of is, does anyone know what state of the union has the only offshore wind farms that are operating in existence today? Anybody know? Virginia, what? State. Massachusetts? No. It's like Delaware, right? And they've got 5 wind farms sitting in the offshore. And those are the only ones that are actively producing offshore wind today. But there's huge plans to develop offshore wind farms off the eastern US. And one of the biggest companies, I'll just use my hand to point. Am I missing something? Is there a pointer that I'm missing? Optimus. Okay. This is Massachusetts. The areas of New York is Delaware. This is the planned area. This green area is the planned area for, I'm used to calling Saddle, Equinor, has this huge plot of land in the offshore area. And they're planning on building all these wind farms. To build off, and these are also, the red are actually communications cables that are coming in to the East Coast, right? Does anyone know the track for Superstorm Sandy? I'm going to show you. Superstorm Sandy, oh, there it is. The Superstorm Sandy came right through here, right? And the Superstorm Sandy came through there. We went out with a boat and collected information because we wanted to see if, was it developing, what was going on the modern seafloor. There were these huge hummocks that were developed on the modern seafloor. So it became a very rugrose surface. A lot of cables got exposed, but then within a year, we went back and it was completely flat. So the thought that the shelf system is not a sedimentologically dynamic area is just a misnomered paradigm, right? So if you have these storms coming through like Superstorm Sandy, you need to be planning your wind farms and planning your cable installations to deal with that type of system. All right, this is a complex, this is way above a PhD in geology here. One of the ways, there are ways to handle this. We can engineer around this. We can put these concrete mattresses over different things to keep things from going back and forth. But the larger problems become failures of installation. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. Hurricane Ivan came through in 2014, nearly 150 mile per hour winds, 33-meter storm waves down near New Orleans. It caused a mass failure off of one of the margins of the Mississippi Delta. And that mass failure swept down through there and slammed into the Taylor Energy rig and threw it 170 meters off its platform. It caused an oil spill 14 years before they capped it. This put Macondo to shame. This was like, there was an oil spill. Nobody wanted to take ownership. Mr. Taylor actually, conveniently or inconveniently, had a heart attack about 6 months later and passed away. And nobody wanted to take ownership of the Taylor rig, not even the Bureau of Land Management. So all these things are happening in these shelf of water systems and settings that we need to be able to mitigate and understand, right? I'm probably fixing to engineer a solution up here for this little thing. So I began to ask questions. How does storm waves influence cross-shelf sediment transport? How does shelf topography influence cross-shelf sediment transport? What role do along shelf currents play in sand movement? What are the processes active in moving sediments of basinward during high stand conditions? These type of simple diagrams, although very useful from DOT in 1984, just capture the very most cartoonish basics about the complexity of these types of systems. So let's look at these first couple of questions about what are the influences moving sediments across the shelf and how is shelf topography influencing shelf sediment transport. As I moved and began to do work out here in the Western Interior, I was fascinated with the distance across which some of the sand was being deposited across the shelf and across the ramp shelf, right? So my thought was, what processes are active out here, you know, that can actually move sediments across those type of distances? So I've always worked in seismic data. Seismic data is very informative about systems. This happens to be from the Mid-Campanian, Paralic to Deepwater Basin in offshore Brazil. This is from a friend of mine, Frodo Jacobson, who they published this really amazing paper in 2010. And you can see that, you know, these type of systems can be imaged in great detail in seismic, but there's a lot you can tell about just good outcrop work and good subsurface work with cores and logs that you can do some quantitative calculations on how sediments are moving from the coastal plain to the beach ridge systems, the offshore systems. The present may not be the key to the future, but the past is probably going to be helpful to help us sort this out. So we're going to look at three things today. A study that we did looking at storm intensity. It was a paleohydraulic study of ancient HCS, hummocky cross-stratified sediments, in the Tuxedo and also in the Cape Sebastian sandstone. We're going to look at topography, because those two things combined together create a completely different scenario for how sediments are moving across the areas and the margins of the Western Interior. The influence of waves on distance traveling of turbidite currents and settings. And then finally, we're going to wrap up looking at an example of some really unusual sediments that are moving along shore in the Trinidad offshore area that's combining influence by structure and structural orientations and how the systems are moving across the basin, right? So as I said, the marine shelf, our classic concepts of marine shelf systems, the shallow shelf can be a very confusing place. These are different terminologies that are used in the literature to describe the shelf. Some people will call something a shore face. Yeah, some people prefer to call it an upper shore face and a lower shore face. The upper shore face and lower shore face are different for some people. Some people only have the lower shore face and upper shore face within 10 meters of water depth, and some people publish it and talk about the lower shore face being between 10 and 30 meters. And some people call the upper shore face between 10 and 30 meters, and the lower shore face between 30 and 70 meters. So you can see the problem, okay? So when you're reading literature about these types of systems, you know, just the terminology is confusing, right? Now then, what really gets confusing are the numbers that are put on the terminology. And this was where we kind of ran into it. To say that mean storm wave base sets at minus 20 to 30 meters. I'm going to tell you that I think that is way too shallow in the Western Interior Cretaceous time, okay? And we'll talk about why. So we have to be careful, one, when we're looking at literature, because the terminology, and we have to be extremely cautious about these numbers, because those numbers are governed by the physiology of the shelf, climate, waves, all of that stuff, okay? We're going to look at HCS, hummocky cross-stratified sediments, okay? Hummocky cross-stratified sediments are a good sedimentologic structure to understand what's going on with waves and currents and storms, right? Hummocky cross-stratified, you know, structures, just for, you know, those of you that haven't seen them in a while, they're these sort of undulating sets of cross laminae that are both concave up and convex, okay? So you get you get swales and hummocks. So concave and convex, right? A lot of times you see this type of thing in outcrop. A lot of these are really cemented because they're out in the shelf and they're getting a lot of shell material and and calcareous material in them. So you get these type of hummocks and swales that develop. They're usually fine sandstones to coarse sandstone. My case is you can get interspersed plant debris in them. So these are setting out in the western interior, and they are your sands that are moving off of the shelf, permeating shelf on the shore face, and they're getting redistributed by the storms in the offshore area, right? The way the storms do that is, so there's a relationship between the size of the hummock and the wavelength of the hummocks and the size and wavelength of the waves at the top of the seafloor. So we can take measure on these hummock systems, and we can calculate the oscillatory shape of the waveforms on the surface. So these really become a measure of oscillation at the seafloor, or at the surface of the ocean. They can tell you how big the waves are, directions they're moving in, stuff like that. So we can use these bed forms to look at how storm intensity varied in ancient oceanways and seaways. And I became very interested in this because they occur pretty much, excuse me, all over the world. This is just a selection of some maps that we developed, where we just went through the literature and looked at the distribution of hummocks. And you can see that, you know, there are some sort of modern to recent day hummocks around the shelves of the world. There are also Miocene, Pleistocene, some of the Eocene. And back in the Jurassic, there are actually Neoproterozoic hummocks in Death Valley. I know because John Gottsinger gave me some locations for it, and I took my trailer out there and boondocked trying to find these Neoproterozoic hummocks, right? He's like, oh, they're so easy to find, you know. This is spoken like a guy that directs the, you know, the rover around Mars, right? So he would think they're easy to find. Oh. If we get into the late Cretaceous, look at the concentration of hummocky cross-stratified paper and publications and occurrences in the western interior Cretaceous. They're thick. And so one of my questions became, why are these hummocks so prolific in the western interior Cretaceous? Well, I tell you, I think one of the reasons is climate was off the charts. It was a super greenhouse time in the western Cretaceous, you know, and you were getting these storms coming into the western Cretaceous seaway and producing these hummocks, right? At first I thought it was preservation. And then I was like, why would they be preferentially preserved, you know, over some other areas? So let's look at some of these hummocks. So the western interior seaway, I talk about the different seaways because the main one through here is just only one. Then there's the Hudson Seaway, the Lawrence Seaway, and then there's the Proto-Gulf of Mexico down here. I should name this the Lesli Seaway. There's a seaway down here that sort of opens to the Proto-Gulf of Mexico, right? And I've queried this, the western interior seaway separates Laramidia. Who knew it was called Laramidia, right? This is Blake's thing. There you go. See, Mike does, because he's looked at the Tuscaloosa sandstone, the sources for the Tuscaloosa all over the Gulf of Mexico. So he does it. It's like Laramidia separated from Appalachia. And so, you know, I've asked Steve Sonnenberg, well, how big was the Western Cretaceous Seaway? And I went after Jeff May on this too. I'm like, how deep was it? And they're like, oh, maybe, because everybody's like, maybe 1,000 meters deep, or, you know, something, but he doesn't think it was that deep, right? And up to 1,500 meters wide. So there's all these generic sort of ideas about the size and depth. And what is your number on the depth?
Depends where you are in the seaway.
Oh my God, just give me a number.
So let's say 350 to 400 meters.
350, 400 meters. See, I like that. I think that's what you said the last time I asked you. Well, it depends on where you're at. Right. So I'm in Denver. How deep is it? So, you know, we have this really great seaway in here, you know, and it's like, just like Jeff said, it may not be that deep. So now waves could come into play a lot more across the seaway if you start shallowing the seaway quite a bit, right? So there's multiple places where you look at cross sections. So here's a whole bunch of these red stars indicating sort of hummocky cross stratified. So sands moving from proximal to distal. This thing doesn't work. It always wants me to find, this is the problem. It wants me to find my mouse I'm gonna have to get you guys a pointer. That's my contribution. So there's a cross section, right? And this is actually from Ron Steele's stuff. And Steele noticed that even Steele could see this, right? And that you get these phases of wave domination and a lot of tide dominated sands and systems that are way out, you know, into the system. It's like 200 miles from the shore face. You're getting these tidally influenced and wave sort of storm influenced beds, right? So this isn't something that's happening right at the edge of the shore face. The other thing that always fascinated me, and this is from the Big Red Book, I call this the Big Red RMAG book, is there's a lot of unconformities out in the marine systems in the Western interior. I mean, I just pulled off a few here. This is like the marine unconformity underneath the Tuxedo sandstone, right? And, you know, here's the one that's sitting underneath the frontier. I mean, that's cutting a lot of section out. These unconformities are frontier, you know, cutting a lot of section out. It's like, so my thought was like, what can generate these scale of unconformities? And everybody's always like, oh, there's structural uplift and you're planing off these. And I'm like, yeah, but some process still has to cut in that environment. You can keep lifting, you can keep like Forlin bulging the whole thing, but it's not going to go subaerial. You're cutting this thing off in a marine environment. So there are a lot of erosive processes that are going on in the Western Interior Seaway. So why are there so many hummocks in the rocks of the Wick, and why are they so big? I'm going to show you how big they are. How do sands get so far away from their shoreline in a ramp such as the Wick? And what causes the formation of these huge magnitude submarine unconformities in the Wick? How does such bathymetry affect sand movements? That's really the key that I want to talk to you about right now. Is I might not have all the answers to why these things exist, but as all good geomorphologists, I know the sort of impact that these will have on the processes, right? So I was walking around and I found some hummocks, okay? These are huge hummocks, because I had looked at hummocks and I'd looked at hummocks in Trinidad. Maria and I were down on the coast of Trinidad, and there were these huge hummocks in like Miocene or younger in Trinidad. But in the Western Interior Seaway, well, I'm walking out into Tuxedo and El Vado, and I find these huge hummocks, and that's not the best picture of them. It's a little dark, but these things are meter scale hummocks. And I was like, how do these things get out here? So I actually found a graduate student that was way smarter than me, Khushbu Arora. And Khushbu works for Aramco now. She works for BP, okay? And there was this guy named John Southern. And she gets reading through his papers, and she's like, she comes into my office with this paper, she's about this tall. And she's like, I think I need to go see this guy, right? And I didn't know. It's like going to see the Wizard of Oz, right? It's like going to see the Wizard of Sedimentology. It's like or it's like going into Mordor. One does not just walk in to see John Southern, right? But in reality, that's what you did. Like, she went up to Boston and she called him and she said, I need to talk to you about your work in hummocks, because his work in hummocks suggested that the size of the hummocks were related to the orbital diameter of the waves on the seafloor. And so she goes up to Boston, she calls his wife, and his wife's like, just a minute, and gives the phone to John. He's out in the garden. And so she just walks down the street, and they became fast friends. So he was on her committee, and she learned an enormous amount from John. So he's just one of those sedimentologists that in our community that's just a really great guy. So we began to look at these hummocks and try to sort out, could we use these hummocks to determine process and the scale of processes that were active? So here's Khushbu's calculations, right? And I'm like, I just put this up. I'm not going to go through each one of these, although I could. No, I could not. So, okay, so I'll tell you a really quick story. Was we were out in the field with our consortium. And we have these guys from industry, and we had a bunch of we had 3 white SUVs from the University of Texas, and they were all white. And And so I gave her an erasable pencil, and she said, I think I need to explain to people. I said, you need to talk about your hummock work. And she's like, I need to explain to people how I derived this. I'm like, all right, good luck with that. And so she pulls up an SUV and she starts like writing equations on it, right? And I'm watching these guys, they're eating their lunch and they're sitting up on the edge of the, and they're eating their lunch, you know, and Howard White is just like turning sheet white. I mean, he doesn't want to, he likes to look at core, but he doesn't want to deal with like all these equations, right? And there were people that were just like, they had no idea what she was talking about. And she gets and she's writing, man, and she writes off the end of a vehicle. And she turns around to me and she goes, I think I need another car. So I pulled up another SUV and she like writes on down. So she explained all this to them. The real reality is you can look at the hummock spacing and you can look at the grain size distribution and you can calculate with that type of information, the orbital diameter, the orbital velocity. And that'll give you the wave period, right? And then you have to make a decision. When she saw the wave period of the hummocks from this area in the San Juan, she kind of freaked out. And she was like, I can't tell people this in public. I'm like, yeah, you're going to tell them, you know, what you have. And so she was trying to decide, are these active storm waves or decayed swell waves? In other words, are these storms generating in the Western interior and blowing storm waves, or are these storm waves coming from like the proto Gulf of Mexico that's bringing decayed swell waves into this environment, right? And she decided that she made a decision, educated decision, that these were decayed swell waves coming from the proto Gulf of Mexico. So does anyone know how big waves are or how big storms are, right? Because I have these people all the time say, you know, this is the biggest storm in the world, you know? And I'm like, well, how big are storms? Like, I don't know, but this is the biggest one ever, right? Like, so we always look at, you know, look at what's going on. So let me see, like, so there's modern storms in the wind speeds, right? Wind speeds are maybe 80 meters per second. And this is big fetch areas like the Gulf of Mexico. Sandy and Katrina had these kind of wind speeds, okay? When you look at what we've got in the hummocks in the Western interior, the storm waves were probably over 40 meters high, and they were probably impacting stuff down to 160 meters in the seafloor, right? So here's storm waves in fully developed seas and storm swell waves in fully developed seas. So storm waves and swell waves using the calculations that we've made, you know, from the hummocks, right? And I'm happy to give you the Excel spreadsheet and turn you loose with that set of equations. And you guys can go to town and check this data and information. I would tell you, Kushbu, actually, I don't know what I'm doing, but Kushbu knows what she's doing. So why were they so big? Well, this was like mid-Cretaceous, so 90 million years ago, right? It was the most extreme carbon cycle recorded in the past 100 million years, possibly they think due to volcanic activity. Temperate forests thrive at polar latitudes, mostly deciduous dominated. So if you go into, I'm sorry, I need to move this. You can't see. Can you see? Okay, you can sit up here if you want to. So there were deciduous dominated forests all the way to the poles, right? Higher evaporation rates, more precipitation at various latitudes. The late Cretaceous storm maximum intensities were higher in today's oceans. Higher wind speeds, higher wave heights, right? They could impact the ocean floor up to 160 meters deep. What happened to the 20 to 30 meters? It went away, people. So, you know, we need to think about the processes going on in the Cretaceous super greenhouse. We need to think about how that impacts processes. You can see that the Coniacean and upper ocean temperatures are believed to have been approximately 33 degrees Celsius. And today, the average temperature of the oceans is 20. But, you know, it's believed, there's a paper that was out in May 2019 suggesting that around the mid-latitude that you can get 27 to 28 degrees Celsius. Remember, today, everyone talking about climate is talking about not letting the temperature of the oceans go up 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. So you're looking at these gaps in ocean temperature that really were driving. If you want to know how storms and storm intensity is going to change from now till the next 100 years or something, if you raise the ocean temperature 2 or 3 degrees, you need to go to the Cretaceous and see what it looked like. I mean, you've got it right there, right? So now we know we have big storms in the Western Interior Cretaceous. So what happens when big storm waves are deepened over a shelf that has terracing? Remember the big erosional surfaces that I talked to you about? A couple of years ago, Rich Botcher, you know Rich, he's that old liar that belongs to this organization. Rich and other colleagues, came in and did this little cross-section, published this little paper in the Western Interior and in the San Juan Basin. And over the Gallup sandstone, there's an erosional unconformity below the base. It's called the basal niobrara unconformity. And that basal unconformity in there is, I don't know, I think Rich said 100, I've got it somewhere, 150 meters deep or 160 or 180 meters of erosional relief, right? So the rate of truncation was huge over just a 5-mile distance. It was a very short distance. This is a terrace. This is a subaqueous terrace, okay? And the place for, an example where you see subaqueous terraces, this happens to be the Blake Plateau. And I'm not saying that it's exactly an analog, but just to give you a visual on what these types of terraces look like, right? So here's 0 to 1,000 meters, I can't remember, centimeters. Kilometers offshore, there's the shelf. These type of terraces can be found today in very storm-dominated sort of Atlantic margin settings. And that's the type of terrace that you were sort of dealing with in these areas of the Western Interior Seaway. Now then, when you have big storms coming into a margin, remember down in here, we have the Mogollon High. There's the edge of the basin. Right there is where the Tuxedo and the big hummocks that I just showed you are in northwestern or northeastern, sort of north central New Mexico, right? And so, I'm sorry, this is Arizona. This is New Mexico. So we're sitting out in here, right? And you have the big storms coming in that were impacting these mountain systems. And you had mountainous areas located near the ocean. It's a perfect scenario for hyperpycnal flows. Hyperpycnal flows are these super sediment laden, high density flows that come moving in, usually from storms or some type of thing, and they just move out, and then all of a sudden they'll collapse down into the basal part of the shelf, the seafloor. So if your shelf has a 160 meter terrace on it, you're going to get turbidites out in the basin, right? So the areas of the San Juan Basin and other areas have turbidites moving through. Now then, so we decided we'd model, so let me back this up. We decided that this thing hates me, man. Let me do that. Let's do this. So we decided that we wanted to model what would happen if we put 160 meter high waves, if we had waves that could influence a turbidite moving along the seafloor. How does that influence the way sediments are distributed? We hypothesized that it would influence it and the sediments would move farther out into the basin. And that's exactly what we saw. So I'm going to show you 2 models. The first one is a model of just a clear turbidite just moving over a system. So you can see what it looks like. It's billowing up. I mean, what happens is in the model, just like in real turbidites, it begins to roll water into its matrix, right? And so it's rolling water in, and it's billowing, and that causes it to lose density. And the reason that the turbidite will stop moving down basin is it just loses its density, and its density is really what drives it. When you add waves to these systems, it confines the top of the turbidite. We used to think about confinement on the margins of the turbidite, but watch what happens when you confine the top by just pushing down on it with wave activity. Okay? It's super fascinating. I don't like to sit around and just watch it all day, but so you can see this thing rolling, almost like things, I mean, it's just going to billow up. And once it begins to get water into its matrix, or into its constituents, it's spilling. And so that's what will slow it down. That's what will kill a turbidite. So it takes all this water into it, right? Look what happens when you confine it. That's real, that pulsing, because we put a little wave paddle in the top of it. And so that pulsing is the waves on the seafloor, right? And it's still got periods where it's billowing, but it's much more confined. We could actually measure the turbulence from the bottom of the flume system up to the top of the deposit. And that turbulence is much lower in this system, right? So what's happening is the red is with the current only. This is 0 up to 30, right? And you can see the waves and currents are suppressing the horizontal velocity, the velocity like this, right? So you get this thing compressed and controlled, and it'll move much farther out into the wick ramp. It'll move stuff actually 30% farther out if you add waves on top of this system, right? So that's one of the things that we see when we look at this type of stuff is, there it is. The wave superimposition reduces the mixing of the ambient water into the turbidity currents, and you get a sharper, clearer boundary, and you get these sediments moving farther out, right? The run-out distances of the shelf turbidite currents substantially increased in the presence of these waves. The turbulence that's added by the waves reduces deposition from suspension, and you get elevated density and more driving force for these turbidites. So I can go to the Elvado in the San Juan Basin, and now I can understand how I can get sands 200 kilometers from the equivalent shoreline system, you know, because probably in the Cretaceous, you had these big storm waves that were moving, these swell waves from the proto-Gulf of Mexico, so they're moving into the basin and sort of dampening, you know, causing these storms and dampening the turbidites that were coming out, falling over these big erosional unconformities and moving off in the basin. So there's a lot of interesting stuff to be looked at out in those basins that we haven't really looked at before. So the very last thing I want to talk about is just this idea. So we talked about the processes. Now let's talk about the geomorphology of the shelf just a little bit. One of the things that has been informative to me working in Trinidad and Tobago and the offshore is that there's a lot of sediment that's being prorated during low stand. The big Orinoco Delta is moving sediment, just blowing sediment out, right? But during high stand, there's a lot of sediment that's moving too. And there's a lot of sediment moving into the offshore deep water during high stand that traditional models would suggest is kind of different. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Orinoco, it's like the 8th largest delta in the world. I always use it as an example too of why you need to go. It's like, this is tide dominated, you know, this is wave dominated, this is river dominated. So I always ask kids, is the Orinoco wave, tide, or river dominated? And Mike can appreciate this. It's like, well, it's all of those, you know, depending on where you're at in the system, right? And so, so Trinidad is a really great partner with the APG. There's great people down there. Saudi Arunin works down there. My student, which I'm going to show you her work, my student is Trisha Alvarez, and she works for a company down in Trinidad now. She taught down there at the university for a while. Decided that university people were weird, and she just wanted to be in industry. So you can see that there's also a lot of sediment that's being shunted from the Guyana current up the Marne. So we've got the Orinoco prorating out this way. We've got sediment coming from the Amazon, mostly fine, muddy sediments coming up here, being shunted by one of the largest currents in the world, running into the bathymetry topography on the seafloor. Sometimes these things come up and you can see them turning and going off into the deeper parts of the basin. The little black blobs are mud volcanoes in here. So there's a lot of topographic complexity in here that these systems have to deal with. This is just, you know, Trisha did a slope map of the seafloor And you can see that these lineations in here, some are faults, but she was struck by the sinuosity of some of these lineations. And when she got and dug in there, she went in and made some profiles of the incisions. So she was sure she could track these incisions along the seafloor. And when she really dug into it, she figured out that these were actually, it's just a couple of cross sections through these. But this one particularly would be running perpendicular to flow in the subaqueous environment. So the currents, the Guyana current is sweeping up through here, and something is cutting these channels in here during high stand. So the other thing that we have in addition to seismic is we have a lot of well data and a lot of core data. So we have a pretty good handle on what's low stand and what's high stand. But the other thing that's critical is the seismic data, because then you can see the orientation of the channels and you can see their relationship to the structure. So she's got, here's a really good example of one of these channels that's being cut. And if you look, it's actually trending northwest and southeast. So here's the channel fill running down the channel. These channels are being cut in a subaqueous environment. They are not being cut at subaerial low stand. We can see the subaerial low stand channels. They're these beautiful west to east channels that are on the low stand nonconformities. But then when you raise sea level on this system and you drown it, then the Guyana current takes over. And it takes advantage of the faults, which are very active at the seafloor, but it takes advantage of the faults, and a lot of these things run sort of parallel to the faults, and they're sinuous. They're really, really interesting features. We actually are trying to finalize a paper on this. There is modern analogs for these. Incisional current analogs of the Tyrrhenian shelf in the Adriatic, or actually not in the Adriatic, but it's off the western side of Italy. And if you look at these systems, just try there. The same thing is happening. Trincari and Normark documented these. The Tiber River's coming in, and you get this longshore current moving through here. Sometimes you get these faults or some type of seafloor feature. And these type of channels are developing present day in a subaqueous environment, and they run parallel to the shelf, right? So this is a process that we don't think about too much, but the reality is this is very different from the sequence stratigraphic models, you know, that we sort of cut our teeth on from Exxon, and that have been modified so much now by so many good people. This is the passive margin older red book for SCPM red book. Actually not SCPM red book, but this was from Van Wagner's, well, this may be SCPM red book too, but I took this out of Van Wagner's sequence between core and outcrop. And you can see that, you know, what we call upon often is we call upon these low stand surfaces, and we understand these low stand surfaces and the channel systems that are associated with this maximum low stand surfaces, but we don't even think about what could be happening, types of erosion and processes on the shelf that are happening during high stand. This is your classic sort of box model of a low stand surface in the offshore. There's a lot of active faulting at the seafloor that influences the size and nature of these big Orinoco distributaries that are coming out through here. But if you look at, and you slice through and look at the high stand systems track, this is what the high stand system track looks like. You've got these channels and they're just low sinuosity, and they're sitting in here, they're current driven, and they're along strike, and they're depositing these sands sitting in here along the front of these unconformities. I'm sorry, along the front of these faults. So to summarize this, I said there's a lot here. In the Western interior, the shelf is a very dynamic area. And the shelf processes, just like everywhere, those classic processes interact with structure, both in the Western interior Cretaceous and in areas like offshore Trinidad and Guyana and Suriname, where we're working now. It's like they interact with those processes to exacerbate their effectiveness and to exacerbate the movement of sediment in the offshore. There was a lot of wave activity in the Western interior Cretaceous. It was kind of high and wild. I mean, it was waves that were eroding the seafloor in possibly 80 to up to 150 meters water depth. So you were seeing that type of oscillatory wave action. It was influencing the energy and maintenance of hyperpycnal gravity flows that were coming off the Mogollon highs and these other highs of the Western Interior and causing them to move hundreds of kilometers, sediments, hundreds of kilometers off in the shelf. The storm wave base is a relative term. It's really influenced by climate and geography. So you really have to take that into consideration, especially in the Western Interior Cretaceous, because climate was so different and processes were so different. The high stand shelf can be a time in some basins of shore parallel processes that are dominating sediment movement, especially where you have active structure. So you need to think about how the structures in the offshore are influencing the traditional processes that you see going on. This is not only important for reservoir characterization and understanding, but it's going to be critical as we transition into these new energy forms of, wave power, also sequestering carbon within these types of shelf systems. It's really important whether your channel sands or your sands are running parallel to the shelf or whether they're running perpendicular to the shelf, right? So we need to consider these types of things when we begin to look at how to move into these new ideas. I have to give a shout out to Patricia and to Kushbu, just two of 75, 80 amazing graduate students that I've had the pleasure to work with. And so we're going to keep doing that at Colorado School of Mines. We continue to work with, I've got some amazingly great students now, and just love to see these guys be so successful, right? And part of that success, a big part of that success is their ability to access communities like this and the funds that you guys provide to help them do research, and to actually what it does is, it expands their research. It doesn't just, we underpin their research or funding, but the funds that you provide allows them to expand to meetings, expand to publications, expand to membership in societies, and be engaged beyond just the margins of their traditional PhD or master's program. So thanks so much, you guys. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I know some of you have to actually work for a living, so feel free to run off.
Was there any other questions or anything?
Mark?
So your neogene examples are ice house with an extreme differentiation between high stand and low stand. Would your Cretaceous greenhouse examples maybe have some transitional phases in terms of shore perpendicular and shore parallel processes because the changes are presumably more gradational?
So the changes between, that low stand and the currents really kicking up and influencing the flooding and stuff. I don't know what that gradation would look like. I'd have to think about that. I've just looked sort of at the end members, but I haven't thought about what that transition looks like. And of course, the transition is going to be controlled by the accommodation that's out there. That's one of the things with the transition would be, as you're transgressing the system, will you just see sort of a thin shell lag or something out there, or will you actually see a sand body associated with that process change? I don't know. That's a good question. That's another piece of research that probably needs to be done out here, because so much of what happens in the reservoir issues are associated with the transition phase. If it's rapid or if it's slow, are you rapidly flooding the system, or are you getting that sort of waste zone of material? So it's a good question. Yes, sir.
So Leslie, to get these big storm waves, my understanding is you need a big fetch.
Yeah.
So you're calling for them to come out of the Gulf of Mexico. So you can actually test that. You would expect the hummocks to change in their height and their spacing as you go southerly through the Cretaceous Interior versus north.
So I had a PhD student after we started doing this, and I wanted her to look at the hummocks that were in the Western Interior and compare and contrast from sort of an axial position, Denver, up to the Arctic Ocean and down to the Gulf of Mexico, and she just couldn't handle that. She gave up the ghost, did something else with another professor. But that was fine. I didn't mind. She was there. I brought her down here from Alaska. But But yeah, you're right. I think you could. I mean, ideally, it would be interesting to see how the hummocks actually vary within that. Now, is there enough fetch in that 1,400? I don't know. We were really settled on things coming from the north and coming from the south, you know? And you'd like to see that, that waning of process. I mean, these are down in northwest, let me see if I can get a picture of. Bastard. Yeah, let me just pull this one up. Oh, not that one. Wait a minute. There you go. You can see that, you know, the ones that we're looking at are right in here. So they're fairly close to that opening. And I don't know, you know, if you've gotten into Canada and looked at these. But she did do a comparison between these out on the West Coast, and she had some big differences in these. They were same age, but you know, it's a very open ocean. So these were open ocean storm waves that come in here. And she thought that these were probably more decayed swell waves that were coming from north or south. That's a difference. Actually, we published this paper, and we were told by Bourget that it was so naive, and I don't know. It was like we probably need to go back and publish it, but it was like you probably shouldn't have sent it to the person that actually did the work. So I shouldn't say that they did the work over here on these outcrops, but have never worked any of these outcrops over here. So. You know, it's classic. Mike's laughing, but he knows exactly what I'm talking about. So we need to get some better interpretation. Any questions, guys? Let me know if you guys see pictures.
I have a question, Leslie.
Send me a note.
Or a state.
Ronnie.
Yes.
Yasm.
I made a comment years ago, sit in a well. I watch the BOP, the camera go up and down. Most days, nothing going on. Then one day, stuff was flying past. And then the next day, a storm hit.
Oh.
Storm generated shelfal currents.
Oh, yeah.
So,
yeah. So
there's all sorts of things going on in the shelf. And topography, my view always is topography, whether it's subaerial or subaqueous, water flows downhill. Even
yeah, that's true. Density flows downhill. That was one of the things.
Nice, though. Thank you. Interesting.
Yeah, thank you. So Ronnie was commenting on, you know, seeing these processes active in the offshore, and I think that's what speaks to this issue of the Sandy's, you know, Superstorm Sandy when it came through completely modified the seafloor. But then what you're doing is you're throwing the seafloor out of equilibrium, and the seafloor spends the next year sort of trying to re-equilibrate itself. And, you know, if we hadn't gone out within 2 weeks of Superstorm Sandy coming through, we'd have never seen these huge hummocks and muds. And so, you know, that is something. So my question became, is like, what does that say about the Western interior and why these things are preserved? I think they're preserved because they're in deeper water than we really think they are. I think that, you know, our concept of waves is we look at hummocks and we're like, oh, 30 meters water depth. And we're out walking around out and out, probably like, oh, 30 meters water depth, you know? And the reality is you may be quite a bit deeper, and that may be why they're preserved, because, you know, you've got this quite a differentiation between, you know, typical process and changes in process.
Why are they so often associated though with upper shore face?
Because we've created that paradigm. We call it upper shore face. And I'm not saying that maybe they're not more prevalent in shallower water systems, but I'll bet their preservation is not as good in shallower water systems. So I don't know, Ronnie, there needs to be a lot more work done with them, because there's no